Right then, brethren, for a few weeks now I've been looking at the book of Judges, so reviewing the book itself. New Testament tells us that all scripture is given by inspiration and profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction, and so on. These things are written down for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So part of the Old Testament, which we can use for learning and so on, is the book of Judges. And we're spending some time looking at it, not in great detail. We're not looking at every chapter and every verse, because that would take probably 10 weeks or more, whereas today's week 4 and we should wrap it up today. So we're hitting the high points. So in the book of Judges, much of them are the low points, all right? And what we've seen so far is that the book of Judges extends over approximately a 300 to 350 year period. It starts approximately at the death of Joshua. So you get Moses dies, Joshua brings the people into the promised land, Joshua and his peers die. Then the book of Judges runs for about 350 years up to the time of the kings, King Saul, King David, and so on. It's that period of time. And one of the things we saw is that in this period in particular, it's noted because every man did that which is right in his own eyes, which you can't do without chaos and near anarchy. And of course, that's what you see throughout the book. Every man doing that which is right in his own eyes. And the book of Proverbs tells us, there is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. So you and I need to be careful not to make the mistake they made of doing what seems right to us. Check the scripture, to the law and to the testimony. What does God's word say about a situation? That's a safer approach to take. And we saw that the period of the Judges is noted for its idolatry, its wickedness. We'll get more details of that today. We also saw, I think, the sin cycle, this sort of 5 or 6 parts. You go round and around from sinning, getting into trouble, crying out to God. He delivers you, you know, peace and security, and you go back into sin and you just go round and around and around. And one of the great themes that comes out, to me, the most important theme, Book of Judges, is God himself. His mercy knows no ends. His patience is there, you know, generation after generation after generation, even though these people are really at times, you know, quite nasty people, quite horrible people, totally unfaithful, turn their back swiftly on God. God's mercy, his patience, his willingness to forgive, right? His love for the people is there, and it's noticeable, and it's, in a sense, it's quite incredible that God would love people as bad as this, or to be fair, as bad as you and I sometimes are. Okay, there were 12 judges in the book of Judges. 6 of them we know very little about, just a name, but 6 of them we have more details, and those are what we've looked at thus far. We had Othniel, he was the first of the judges. There was Ehud, the left-handed guy with a dagger, which he stuck somewhere. There was Barak and Deborah who worked with him. There was Gideon, right, with his 300 men reduced from 32,000. Last week we saw Jephthah, the guy with the foolish vow, and of course Samson and his rather sad story. But I mean, Barak and Gideon and Jephthah and Samson all appear by name in Hebrews chapter 11, you know, the heroes of the faith. So they are genuine heroes. God saw it worthwhile to put their names there in Hebrews 11. So it's worthwhile looking at their lives, learning what we can, and using what we can. With the case of Gideon and Samson, we could see the other, you know, when God wants to achieve something, he doesn't need big numbers, right? With Gideon, God deliberately reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300. That's more than enough for God. And with the case of Samson, it's just one. Just Samson plus God, right? And so God doesn't need big numbers, and we know that, but that's a couple of illustrations. With Jephthah, he made that foolish vow, you know, the first thing that comes out of my house, etc. And we saw last week, that you and I have to be careful with our words. Think first, engage your brain first. Be very, very careful with vows. We'll see some more of that today. In the case of Samson, we saw a guy who, it was a sad ending to his life. He was a person whose potential was completely unfulfilled. His birth was announced by the angel of the Lord. So from birth, God had planned to use Samson mightily, but Samson had unfulfilled potential because he never did deal with his problem, his lusting for women, when that finally saw the end of him. So you and I can learn a lesson there. We don't want to end up not fulfilling our potential, but you and I need to take care. If we've got weaknesses, and probably most of us do, we need to deal with them, not be like Samson. So that was a story pretty much of the 6 well-known judges. The other 6 we didn't look at because there's no real detail. That's the judges. Book of Judges, we looked at them, right? But that still leaves us about 5 chapters at the end of the book itself, chapters 17 through 21 inclusive. And if we're going to review the book of Judges, I think it's right that we complete the study looking at these last few chapters. Now, when you get to, and you may as well open your Bible at chapter 17 of Judges, because we'll be starting there in a moment. When you look at these final chapters, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, that's the last 5 chapters, you might think initially you get to the story of Samson and then you move on to chapter 17, 18, 19. Not so. That's how it's written. But the events of these last 5 chapters actually begin way back early in the story of the period of the Judges. We'll see that a couple of places. So it belongs at the beginning of that 300-year period. Looks like it starts, chapter 17 probably starts around about 20 years or so after the death of Joshua. And what we'll see in these chapters is just how bleak conditions were in Israel. Up till now, we've seen the 6 judges, Othniel and Ehud and Gideon and so on. It mentions in passing the people were evil and went into some sort of oppression or captivity. It doesn't give us many details. The last few chapters give us more details than we'd like. And it just shows us the terrible condition of the people early on after the death of Joshua. The problems, the immorality. It's quite depressing reading in some ways, and reading it is depressing. First time I read it, I was about probably 16 when I read through the book of Judges first time round. I was utterly depressed at the end of it. But then I think, well, God had to actually see it in real time. If I'm depressed, what's God making of these people, his people? They're absolutely terrible, right? And we'll see that. So we'll finish off the book of Judges just by looking at the background conditions to the time of the Judges, right? The Judges delivered, but we don't see too much about the actual nature of the people, other than just a brief reference to they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Well, these chapters show us just how evil the evil was. So let's start in Judges 17. And I won't be making too much comment because I think it's pretty much, it reads the way it is. I'll make a comment here and there, but largely today just more or less picking up on the stories. And there's 2 stories, one of Micah and his Levite, and another Levite and his concubine. And so there's two tales. We're going to be looking at 2 stories, right? 2 quite bad stories. Chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. Now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and in which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears, here is the silver with me. I took it. Thieving son. And the 1,100 shekels is quite a treasure. We can see a bit later, I think, that 10 shekels would be a year's salary, typically. So 1,100 shekels is a lot of money. And this son took it. His mother put a curse on the money. And he finally says, you know what? It was me, Ma. Here it is. And his mother said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my son." I don't think my mum would have said that. It had been
I wouldn't either.
out the door or out the window. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, "I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to Jehovah for my son, to make a carved image and a molded image. Now therefore I will return it to you." Thus he returned the silver to his mother. Then his mother took 200 shekels of silver, gave it to the silversmith, and he made it into a carved image and a molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. So the mother is odd, the son is a thief, and she takes this silver that's now reappeared and makes it into a carved image and a molded image. Idols, silver idols, which of course is idolatry. And she would know better, and Micah would know better, right? They've heard the law. The man Micah had a shrine, really? And made an ephod, that's a priestly garment, and household idols. And he consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. Well, how can you do that? So he's not a young son. This son, Micah, has his own family, and his mother's living there with them, and he has a shrine in his house. Now he's got some special silver idols to worship, and he consecrates one of his sons as a priest, right? You can't do this. This is typical, one imagines, of the state of the land. People had completely turned away from God. If they knew the law, which they should have done, because they would be coming across it from time to time, they should be teaching the law to their sons. That's what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy. This law shall not depart from you. You shall teach it to your sons when you stand up, when you sit down, when you go in, when you come out. Write it in the doorposts of your houses. Right? They're terrible. Verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's one of the key problems, right? They're doing what they think is right. Now, it's not right, and you know it's not right, and I guess if you challenge them, they might have admitted it's not right. You can't set up your own worship system just the way you want. I'll have candles over here, and an idol over there, and flowers over here. I'll write songs, and I'll ordain my son to be a priest. What? Verses 7 through 13. Now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite, and was staying there. The man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. An itinerant preacher, perhaps. Then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. And Micah said to him, "Well, where do you come from?" So he said to him, "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm on my way to find a place to stay." Now, because the Levites were a special tribe to serve the Lord at the tabernacle in these days and so on, right? So they're specially trained to perform service to Jehovah. And from the Levites, you would typically expect to learn the truth of God, because that's sort of their purpose, right? So he said to him, "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm on my way to find a place to stay." Micah said to him, "Well, I can solve that for you. Dwell with me, and be a father and a priest to me. And I'll give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance, your board and keep." So the Levite went in, and the Levite was content to dwell with the man. And the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Now, not anybody can be a priest, of course. You have to be in the house of Aaron. I don't know if this guy was. And Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as a priest." Pretty stupid, really. So the Levites The Levite's not a good example, is he? Because he's essentially, I think,
I know a few of these.
he's essentially a hireling. He's being offered a bit of money.
I know lots of them in the
Room,
churches of God.
board, nice house, shrine,
Yeah.
idols. I become
Car.
a priest in this household, which might be 15 or 20 or 25 strong, for all I know, right? A lot of money in the household, 1,100 shekels of silver, so quite a wealthy sort of home, right? And but the Levite's not doing what he should be doing.
No.
He should be serving at the tabernacle.
I know what
or
they do
elsewhere.
in the church today. Yeah,
You know, and I think we've all come across hirelings,
we still do.
people who have a religious appearance, especially, you know, pastors and such,
Take your tithes.
who go where the money goes.
Yeah,
I think we've all heard the stories. I think way back in the days when worldwide was breaking up, many of the ministers of that time wanted to leave and belong to another split or splinter or whatever, but they wouldn't until the money was there.
They followed the money, honey.
Only when there were enough people around to produce enough money would they then bravely and courageously stand for the truth of God. But not until the money was there first, right? So nothing unusual about that particularly. And the Levite was that way inclined. He liked a bit of money. So at this stage of the game, we have, you know, one family, Micah's family, which has got idols and shrines and their own pet Levite living in the kennel, right? And you think, well, is that a single story, or would there be others like Micah? I think the answer would be the writer of the book of Judges is just giving us one illustration, but I would imagine that the story was similar in many places. Idolatry, people who've forgotten the laws of God quickly, and Levites who are, at least a number of them, rather dodgy characters. So let's move on to chapter 18. We discover that idolatry and being dodgy spreads. So chapter 18, verses 1 through 7. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. Remember, this is very early on, after they've entered the promised land. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. It looks like they had not fully taken control of the land initially allotted to them, and now they're looking for additional territory, a bit more space, and so on. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. They said to them, "Go, search the land." So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. While they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. Possibly they knew him, or more likely, I suspect, it was his accent that sort of gave him away. Oh, hang on, that sounds like a Levite from... They turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What have you here? Because shouldn't you be by the tabernacle or somewhere?" He said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me. He has hired me," I guess hireling, "and I have become his priest." It should be God's priest, of course, but yeah, okay. So they said to him, "Well, okay, please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace."
Be blessed.
Amen. Be blessed. "The presence of the Lord Jehovah be with you on your way." Amen. Hallelujah. So, I mean, they shouldn't be asking the Levite, but I guess if they're not really sharp, well, he's a Levite. He's a man of God. So we'll ask him to inquire of God if it's going to work out well for us. And he says, "Oh, of course it will. You know, preach smooth things. Go in peace, my brother." Right? So the 5 men departed and went to Laish. That's the town they're going to capture later. They saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. there were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. So they're looking for new territory. They find this place, Laish. It looks good to them, and they're going to basically plan with the rest of their tribe to take it over, right? But you can see here they're very sloppy when it comes to religion and truth. Even a pretend man of God they're happy with. Some people are. They still have a desire to be religious, even if it's not true or accurate. Let's move on to the story, verses 14 through 20. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, the rest of the tribe, "Do you know that there are in these houses an ephod," this religious garment, priestly garment, "household idols, a carved image and a moulded image," metal, silver, I guess. "Now therefore consider what you should do." So they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite man, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. The 600 men armed with their weapons of war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate, so nearby. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the moulded image. Took meaning stole. The priest stood at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. So it's quite a decent little, military group here now. But they're busy stealing Micah's idols. Verse 18. When these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the moulded image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Be quiet, put your hand over your mouth, come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be a priest to the household of one man, like Micah, or that you be a priest to a tribe and a family in Israel?" So the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, the household idols, and the carved image, and took his place among the people, among the men. So he's now got the view that, well, hang on a second, be a priest to one family, Micah and his mum and his brothers and sisters, whatever, right? The next door neighbor or two, or a promotion. Wow, I'm going to be the man to the tribe of Dan. Now you're talking. What sort of bonuses do I get there, right? So he's off because he's unfaithful to God, and he's ambitious, and he's power hungry, I suppose, and he's corrupt, as many preachers have been. Verses 27 through 31. So they took the things Micah had made, and the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish, this nearby, not too nearby, this Gentile town, to a people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer for Laish, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. They had no nearby allies. So when the Danites attacked them, they were successful. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, so they rebuilt the city and dwelt there. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. And this was apparently quite common. The tribe of Dan, wherever they went, seemed to rename the place they landed Dan, nearby river Dan, the coast Dan, harbours Dan. It's just the way they left a trail of Dans everywhere, right? Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, the one they brought with them, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the real house of God was in Shiloh. So, Dan has a reputation in the Bible of being one of the first to go into idolatry and one of the last to come out of it, if indeed ever, right? So they seem to have set up a temple here. It mentions Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. That's quite likely the name of the Levite, all right, because he just appears. But the story is about Levite, the Levite who brings the carved image, the molded image to the land. So it's quite likely that his name is actually Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. Now, the commentators will tell you that Manasseh probably is Moses, right? The original manuscripts allow for that as a translation, the Latin Vulgate, the Septuagint, some others. And what they reckon is that the later rabbis, they were sort of copying the scriptures, changed it deliberately, because this is a nasty, stupid Levite, right? A very corrupt Levite. And they don't want to have the name of Moses there because it might be embarrassing to say that, Moses' grandson is a terrible Levite who has set up an idolatrous center for one of the entire tribes of Israel. So it could be Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. You find that in many of the commentaries. Irrespective, the Levite has set up a worship center available for the whole tribe of Dan. Right, so we had Micah and his little family. Now we've got the entire tribe, maybe 100,000 plus, worshipping idols, courtesy of the Levite in the territory of Dan, at Dan's capital, right? So Dan's a terrible example in many, many ways. I mean, much later on, after Solomon dies, this guy Jeroboam comes along, if you remember. Jeroboam is the king of Israel, tribes in the north. He sets up 2 golden calves for the people to worship. One is at Dan, of course, because Dan is renowned for its idolatrous way of life, right? And you can see it there. So in these days that we're looking at, you've got individual families like Micah's who are got shrines, things like that. I mean, I've seen shrines in the past. I mean, I've been in homes with shrines. If you grow up as a Catholic, you come across that. It's not uncommon in Catholic homes, in olden days at least, and I suspect still today. You can find a little alcove in the house, and there'll be maybe a crucifix, some candles, perhaps a picture of the Sacred Heart, if you know what that is, or the Blessed Virgin, whatever, and there'll be prayers said, and you light the candles and all the rest of it. So I've been there. I've done that.
I've got 2 T-shirts
in the past. Well, I've got 2 T-shirts and tickets. So that's how people, worshipped individually. Then an entire tribe. There are only 12 tribes. One of them is engaged in wholesale, established, institutionalized idolatry. And it stays there until the captivity, which is hundreds of years later. So it's bad, right? You get the impression religion is bad in Israel in these particular days. And then after that, you get to one of the worst episodes in Israel's history. It was an embarrassment to Israel. God occasionally referred back to it in future times. The terrible events that took place at a place called Gibeah, which we'll sort of look at now. It's one of the most appalling incidents in Israel's history. So let's start in Judges 19. Let's read verses 1 through 8. And what we're seeing here is a couple of windows into the conditions of the period of the judges, right? Window 1 took us into Micah and the tribe of Dan. We can see there the state of the people, not good at all. The next window we look through shows us some terrible moral problems of the people. Chapter 19, verses 1 through 8. It came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, got that there was a certain Levite, another one, staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So when he got there, she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw the Levite, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with them 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Yeah, so far,
So good.
fairly straightforward story, you would have thought. It almost looks like the Levite might be a half-decent guy who's gone after his concubine, sort of a wife essentially, although you wonder why she left. It says played the harlot, but some commentators say that doesn't mean necessarily being immoral. It just means that she left and took off for reasons that might become clearer later. Verse 5, Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and the Levites stood to depart. Now, you probably would, that'd be sensible. Get up early in the morning, just after daylight, and you head off because you've got some way to go before you can get safely to your destination by nightfall. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterwards go your way. So they sat down, and the two of them ate and drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, Please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry. Let's drink a bit more. And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning of the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, Please refresh your heart. So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. A very hospitable father-in-law, right? So he keeps bringing out, more salmon and cucumber sandwiches, nice cup of Earl Grey tea, and they relax, watch some telly, and have a nice time. But now it's afternoon, and it's long past the time when any sensible person would have got off on their way. So he does eventually leave now, the Levite with his concubine and his servant, but it's really quite late. Not wise. There's not enough time, daylight left to get to a safe destination. Pick up the story, verses 10 through 12. So the father-in-law says, Stay a bit longer, but the man was not willing to spend that night. So he rose and departed, and came opposite Jebus, that is now known as Jerusalem. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. They were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. That leads into the coming problems. And the servant said to his master, Come, please, let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites, and lodge in it. But the master said to him, We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. And they were sort of like Gentiles. We will go on to Gibeah, which is going to be a big problem, right? So he's reluctant. The night is nearly upon them. There's a place here we could go, says the servant, but the Levites, not too sure really, because don't really know these people. We'd be better off, you would have thought, staying among our fellow brethren, other Israelites. So let's get to verses 15 through 21. They turned aside there to go to lodge in Gibeah, town nearby, a town that belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. That might be a concerning sign, because the culture in those days was, people are traveling. There were no motels and hotels of that type back then. So if you were traveling, you'd be welcomed into most people's homes. They just offer up their home, bed, look after your animals for you. It's just what people did. The fact that nobody's going to do it in Gibeah is like, that's a bit odd. Just take for granted people would be hospitable, but what's this all about? Just then, an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. Gibeah was Gibeah of Benjamin. The people who normally lived there, people who were born and grew up there, were Benjamites, right? Verse 17, when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveller in the open square of the city, and the old man said, Where are you going? Where do you come from? He said to him, We're passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. Now I'm going to the house of the Lord. but there is no one here who will take me into his house, although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant. There is no lack of anything. People haven't got to be out of the way to look after us. We can feed ourselves and our animals. And the old man said, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square. So he brought him into his house, gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. That's what should have happened. That's hospitality. That's the cultural norm of the day. But apparently not for the men of Gibeah. Verse 22, as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, I think the margin says men of Belial, or men of Belial, depending on your pronunciation, surrounded the house and beat on the door. And it means beat. It's not knocking on the door. These guys are thumping and pounding the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house, that we know him carnally. All right? So this turns out to be a bunch of, as we'll see, homosexual rapists. Right? It says there, certain men of the city, perverted men. Don't know how many there were, but these are men of Belial, men of Belial, and they want the man so they can rape him. Homosexual, rape. So it turns out that the Gibeah is not unlike Sodom. In fact, the chapters are the same. This is Judges 19. You'll find Sodom and Gomorrah are in Genesis chapter 19. Just remember the 19s. That's where you get them. But of course, Sodom and Gomorrah was not Israelites. It was days of Abraham. Israel didn't exist in those days. But you couldn't make allowances. I mean, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because he was appalled at their behavior, their conduct, right? But this is Israel. You'd have surely thought Israel was far above somewhere like Sodom, but it's not, right? Verse 23, but the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing. But the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. When day began to break, they let her go. So this concubine, it said, verse 25, but the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine, took his concubine. Adam Clark in his commentary says the Hebrew word there for took isn't just took, it is, grabbed under protestation and sort of pulled her and threw her out. Because obviously she's not going to go voluntarily. She's not going to, okay, then I'll go out there and be raped by these men and killed by them. I'm okay with you, master. Right? So he grabbed her. So, I mean, nobody comes out of this looking particularly good, other than perhaps, the concubine donkeys are okay as well. But the people, the men of Gibeah are evil. Evil. The master of the house is evil. He's saying, well, you can have my daughter and this man's concubine, and the Levite is pretty evil. Because he grabs his concubine against her will, pulls and pushes her out the door to save his own neck. Right? It's an appalling sort of story. So they gang of rapists rape her all night long. Verse 26, then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was till it was light. But she's dead, it turns out. When her master arose in the morning, Mr. Super Levi, and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine, fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. I guess she'd sort of crawled back, wounded and badly injured, gets as far as there and expires. And he said to her, "Get up, let us be going."
Nice Levite he was, yeah.
Hanging isn't perhaps good enough, but you get the impression this is not this is another Levite who's as bad as the other one. The other one's just religiously imposter, right? Busy teaching the entire nation of tribe of Dan to worship silver idols and whatever. But this guy's like, "Get up, woman. I know you've been raped all night long, but I'm in a hurry. I need my breakfast. If we get down early enough, we can get 2 for 1 at Denny's. Come on, let's get moving, lass." Right? So he said to her, verse 28, "Get up, let's be going." But there was no answer because she's dead. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place, back to his home. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and chopped her into 12 pieces, limb by limb. Don't like the sound of this at all. And sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. 12 pieces, 12 tribes. He's going to make a statement to Israel about what's happened to my concubine here in Gibeah. And so it was, all who saw it, verse 30 said, "My word, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up." So the whole nation pretty much is astonished and appalled. Oh my word. I guess the Levite must have put some written commentary. Here's a piece of my concubine and here's a story what took place. I imagine the story was edited to omit his complete failure to be a man, right? And of course the people think, what? This woman has been raped and killed by men in Israel? Oh my word, appalling. What do we do now? Right? So let's start chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. So all the children of Israel came out from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, as well as from the land of Gilead, and the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. And the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. So the army, 400,000 strong. And then in brackets it puts, now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah, but obviously implied is Benjamin didn't join them. Then the children of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this wicked deed happen? Tell us more, explain." So the Levite explains, what took place. Nasty men of Gibeah, my poor concubine, raped and essentially murdered by these animals. I'm pretty sure he didn't say, but of course I was a complete coward and didn't stand in the way and didn't offer any defense. I'm sure he omitted those details, right? So let's drop down to verse 8. So all the people arose as one man, having heard the story, saying, "None of us will go back to his tent, back home, nor will any turn back to his house. But now this is a thing which we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. We will take 10 men out of every 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, 100 out of every 1,000, 1,000 out of every 10,000, to make provisions for the people, that when they come to Gibeah in Benjamin," it's Benjamin, right? So earlier Benjamin didn't join these guys, right? You can see why. "That they may repay all the vileness that they have done in Israel." So all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, united together as one man, which, so far sounds okay, I guess. Although you feel a bit sad that it's come to this, that the tribes of Israel are heading off to destroy the city of Israel, and the men of Gibeah, they're having lots here, so it's 10 out of 100, 1,000 out of 10,000. Verse 12, "Then the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin," who hadn't turned up, if you remember, saying, "What is this wickedness that has occurred among you? Now therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men, the men of Belial, who are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and remove the evil from Israel." which I suppose is fair. These men are criminals. They've committed rape and murder. The law, it's a capital offence. So if you deliver these men up from Gibeah, identify them, the 10 or 20 or 50, whatever it was, hand them over and we'll execute them and job done. Right? But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of their brethren, the children of Israel. Instead, the children of Israel gathered together from their cities to Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. So, for whatever reason, Benjamin is going to look for tribal loyalty. So rather than handing these men over to justice, even if it's rough justice, they decide they're going to defend the men of Gibeah, the men of Belial. They're going to go and fight against the rest of Israel, right? So it's a bit odd to me, but that's what they decided. And we're not going to read the entire story, of course, because it'll take a bit of a while, but you can read through it. There's a couple of early battles between the men of Israel, the men of Benjamin, and surprisingly, the men of Benjamin come off better in the first couple of battles. About 40,000 Israelites are killed, right? Which is not good, is it? We're talking here about, God's people in the promised land. Should be enjoying the land of milk and honey, and out of whose, countryside you can dig out copper and iron and gold, and there's vineyards and orchards, and it should be a land of plenty and abundance and peace and prosperity, not civil war, which is what you've got going on here, right? Let's drop down to verses 26 to 28. So they've been defeated a couple of times early on, picking up in verse 26. Then all the children of Israel, that is, all the people, went up and came to the house of God and wept. They'd been defeated. That's probably part of the reason. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening. And they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Tabernacles here. So the children of Israel inquired of the Lord. The ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. So they're getting as close to God as they can. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days. And they said, Shall I yet go again out to battle against the children of my brother Benjamin, or shall I cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hands. So they're not too sure what to carry on, right? But obviously something must be done about Benjamin. But it mentions there in verse 28, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, was ministering in those days at this location. That's where we can see that this is quite early in the history of the time of the judges, because Phinehas was a guy mentioned in the book of Numbers. You might remember the story. One of the Israelites, men of Israel, brought back a lady Midianite and was having a pleasant time with her in his tent. And Phinehas took a javelin, went in and speared them both. Remember that story? That was in the wilderness. So Phinehas is still alive here. So it's not too many years, later after they left the wilderness. Best guess is something like 20 years after the death of Joshua is when these events are taking place. So it's not like you might think you read through the book of Judges, you get to the end of the book, and that's after the days of, Gideon and Jephthah and Samson. No, these events are right at the beginning, right at the front end. It's just that the authors put them at the end because I guess he thinks, I wonder if people understand how bad things were in those days. Oh, let me describe just how bad it really was. So chapters 17 to 21 tell us just how appalling it was, and why they went into captivity so often, and why God had to raise a judge to temporarily give them some respite and some relief. But then they'd go straight back into the sinfulness, and that sin cycle went round and round and round again. You got to say, God has to be merciful, doesn't he, to put up with this lot. So they're told here tomorrow Benjamin will be put into your hands, right? So let's read verses 29 to 30. So then Israel set men in ambush all around Gibeah, and the children of Israel went up against the children of Benjamin on the third day and put themselves in battle array against Gibeah as at the other time. So this time they have some special ambushes which they plan, and it works, verses 43 to 48. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily trampled them down as far as the front of Gibeah toward the east. And 18,000 men of Benjamin fell. All these were men of valor. Then they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they cut down 5,000 of them on the highways. Then they pursued them relentlessly up to GIDEON and killed 2,000 more of them. So all who fell of Benjamin that day were 25,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of valor. That's, quite a lot of their soldiers have now been killed. But 600 men, verse 47, turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they stayed at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. And the men of Israel weren't finished, and this is probably unnecessary, but they turned back against the children of Benjamin, struck them down with the edge of the sword from every city, men and beasts, and also, it turns out, women and children, all who were found. They also set fire to all the cities they came to. So having killed 25,000 plus Benjamites, 600 run off into the mountains to hide. Israel then turns, sets fire to the cities of Benjamin, and kills everything, right? So it's pretty violent. It's not merely the men of Gibeah who should have been dealt with, early on. If Benjamin had any sense, would have handed over these 10, 25 guys, 50 guys, whatever, dealt with, end of story. But now Benjamin, the tribe, is almost gone. Cities are burnt, men and beasts killed, women partly as well. We've got 600 soldiers left. So technically the tribe of Benjamin is in real danger of going extinct, right? And the 600 men who are hiding in the rocks of Rimmon have potentially no women. So even if they're allowed to live on, all the women of Benjamin have been killed. Let's read verses 21, Judges 21, verses 1 to 3. Now the men of Israel had sworn an oath at Mizpah. The danger, oaths, think, saying, none of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin as a wife. Then the people came to the house of God again and remained there before God till evening. They lifted up their voices and wept bitterly and said, O Lord God of Israel, why has this come to pass in Israel, that today there should be one tribe missing or about to go missing in Israel? 12 tribes, 600 guys left, and that's all. And the rest of the men had said, we'll not give any of our wives, any of our daughters to be their wives. We've taken an oath. So 600 males from Benjamin are all going to die out eventually, even if we don't kill them. Right? So you can be careful about, vows you make. Might seem okay at the time. Verses 4 through 12. So it was on the next morning that the people rose early, built an altar there, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. The children of Israel said, who is there among all the tribes of Israel who did not come up with the assembly to the Lord? For they had made a great oath. They're good at these, but they're not always thinking them through. They had made a great oath concerning anyone who had not come up to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. And the children of Israel grieved for Benjamin their brother and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today. What shall we do for wives for those who remain, seeing we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them our daughters as wives? And they said, what one is there from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to Mizpah to the Lord? Who didn't join us in this initial battle? And in fact, it turns out, no one had come up to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were counted, indeed, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So one city had remained aloof, not joined, this conflict, yeah. So the congregation sent out there 12,000 of them was valiant men, and commanded them, saying, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, including the women and children. And this is the thing you shall do. You shall utterly destroy every male and every woman who has known a man intimately. So they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man intimately, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. But okay, fair enough, but these are fellow Israelites. They've killed nearly all of Benjamin, including men, women, and children. They're now busy killing the people of Jabesh Gilead, which are fellow Israelites. You're thinking, what can God make of this? What disaster. These people are utterly out of control, aren't they? They might seem like, they're trying to deal with a terrible problem. The men of Belial at Gibeah, I get they're trying to do something about that, but at what cost? In terms of civil war and destruction, death, right? But now, anyway, out of all of that, they've got 400 virgins, right? And 600 men of Benjamin hiding in the mountains. That's partial solution, right? And of course, one has to assume that they're all doing what they think is right in their own eyes. But it's one ungodly decision leading to yet another ungodly, violent decision leading to even more bloodshed and all these stupid vows they keep giving left, right, and centre. Let's read verses 13 to 23. Then the whole congregation sent word to the children of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon and announced peace to them. Well, fine. So Benjamin came back at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead. And yet they had not found enough for them. 600 men, 400 women, not quite the right balance. And the people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a void in the tribes of Israel. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who remain, since the women of Benjamin have been destroyed?" Why did you do that? Right? And they said, "Well, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe may not be destroyed from Israel." Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel, and one of them's potentially about to go extinct because of the stupidity of this bunch. However, we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the children of Israel have sworn an oath, saying, "Cursed be the one who gives a wife to Benjamin." Maybe they just apologize to God and say, "Lord, sorry God, we made this stupid oath, we didn't think it through, please forgive us, and we want to give women to these men so that Benjamin, one of your tribes, can continue," but they didn't. Then they said, verse 19, "In fact, you know what? There's a yearly feast of the Lord in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebonah." Now that might have been unleavened bread. I suspect it's probably more like tabernacles or something. "Therefore they instructed the children of Benjamin, saying, 'Go, lie in wait in the vineyards and watch. And just when the daughters of Shiloh come out to perform their dances, then come out from the vineyards, and every man catch a wife for himself
I've seen the movie.
from the daughters of Shiloh. Then go to the land of Benjamin.'" Yeah, we've all seen Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Howard Keel and the brothers who go off and abduct a few women. Them Sabine women, right? This is the original of the story. Verse 22. "Then it shall be when their fathers or their brothers come to us to complain about their daughters being abducted, then we will say to them, 'Well, okay, yeah, but let's be kind to them for our sakes, because we did not take a wife for any of them in the war. For it is not as though you've given the women to them at this time, making yourselves guilty.'" You didn't give them, which we said the oath is you can't give them, but if they come and steal them away, that's different. "And the children of Benjamin did so," verse 23, "and they took enough wives for their number from those who danced, whom they caught." Not sure what the young ladies made of it. They might have been happy enough, but it doesn't say. "Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and they rebuilt the cities and dwelt in them." So all's well, sort of, that ends well. Although there's heaps of bodies left, right, and centre, right? I mean, it's terrible, really. I mean, God had to watch all this, right? We can read about it and find it utterly depressing, but God watched it, saw it, and after this, God raised up Othniel and Ehud and Deborah and Barak and Gideon, and God continued to be merciful and kind and tries best to get this lot straightened out. Of course, to this day, they still aren't straightened. So you read about God being long-suffering. This is the stuff that God has to suffer long, all right? And then the author of the book of Judges summarizes it for us with the last verse of this last chapter, 21 and 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that, of course, is perhaps the real lesson, apart from God's marvelous mercy and patience and kindness and compassion, which is difficult to measure. You've got the fact that human beings, if they do what's right in their own eyes, you get the book of Judges. Absolute disaster in the history of Israel. Okay, so hopefully we've learned something from the book of Judges, written for our admonition. And if not, well, that's me finished for sure. Okay, with that we'll conclude today's Bible study.